On the surface, the recent Abundant Life Christian School shooting in Madison, Wisconsin, mirrors the Columbine High School tragedy in unsettling ways, most obviously through the choice of attire by the young perpetrator. Natalie Samantha Rupnow, the 15-year-old shooter, was photographed wearing a shirt nearly identical to one worn by Eric Harris before he and Dylan Klebold launched their infamous rampage in 1999. This chilling echo has caught public attention, but while matching t-shirts may be a symbol of cultural or ideological influence, there's another, far more pervasive common denominator we should examine: a possible empathy deficit crisis, driven by chronic exposure to microwave radiation in our children's daily environments. As we struggle to understand why school shootings continue to plague our nation, it's time to look beyond superficial coincidences. The grim possibility is that we're not just dealing with random acts of violence. We may be witnessing the long-term effects of an environment saturated with electromagnetic fields, or EMFs, that disrupt the normal wiring of developing brains. The legislation that enabled this, Section 704 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, prevents parents and communities from standing in the way of cell tower placements near schools, effectively exposing children's brains to a low-level chronic noise that can degrade critical traits like empathy, attention, and moral judgment. Modern science has long moved past the simplistic view that wireless radiation only matters if it heats tissue. Non-thermal effects are now documented, with studies linking EMFs to oxidative stress, neurotransmitter imbalances, and hormonal disruptions. These changes can influence neurodevelopment at its most fundamental level. The result? Conditions like autism, ADHD, and gender dysphoria are on the rise, suggesting that bioelectric noise might be scrambling the signals that guide normal trait inheritance. One of these traits is empathy, the capacity to understand and resonate with others' emotions. If EMFs can distort the delicate bioelectric communication that underpins attention spans and social cue recognition, why wouldn't they also affect empathy circuits? An empathy deficit, or what we might term empathy deficit disorder, EDD, is the logical extension of this environmental assault on developing minds. If empathy is eroded, moral reasoning and emotional restraint can suffer. The tragic outcome may manifest in extreme behaviors, like school shootings, where a perpetrator displays a chilling lack of regard for human life. No amount of fencing, metal detectors, or gun laws can fully counter the subtle biological sabotage of empathy at its source. At the heart of this crisis lies an almost unknown piece of legislation, Section 704 of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This federal law forbids state and local governments from rejecting cell tower placements on health grounds. Parents who suspect a tower near their child's school may contribute to developmental harm have no legal recourse. The corporations deploying these towers have no obligation to prove their safety against these non-thermal neurological effects. This regulatory straitjacket effectively ensures we remain guinea pigs. Children spend their formative years bathed in wireless emissions, from cell towers on school grounds, to Wi-Fi routers in every classroom, to smartphones in their pockets. We focus on the visible aspects of school safety: cameras, guards, lockdown drills, while ignoring a silent environmental threat that might be degrading the very traits that keep society stable and compassionate. Rising tragedies, rising complexity. The parallel doesn't end with attire. Columbine was one of the first major school shootings to ignite the national conversation, and in the decades since, these tragedies have only become more frequent. We see patterns: autism and ADHD diagnoses soaring, gender dysphoria reported at unprecedented levels, and empathy seemingly in decline. The causes are manifold, but the overlooked factor is that EMFs might be fueling a low-fidelity developmental environment where critical human traits are lost in the static. If we accept that EMFs can influence cognitive and emotional development, then each new tower erected without community approval, each router placed beside a classroom desk, each phone pressed against a young head, might be tipping the scales further into chaos. Cancer, once the primary fear associated with EMFs, may be the least of our worries if bioelectric disruptions set the stage for moral and emotional unraveling. A moral obligation to protect our children's brains. No parent wants to believe that their child's empathy or moral compass could be eroded by something as ubiquitous as wireless radiation. Yet, dismissing this concern as crazy only perpetuates ignorance. The science is evolving, and the preliminary data is alarming enough to warrant serious inquiry. We must investigate whether EMFs contribute to empathy deficits and the conditions that frequently accompany it. We must acknowledge that Section 704 stands in our way. To restore mental health to our children and protect their developmental blueprint, we must dismantle this unconstitutional law. We must empower local governments to say no when towers threaten the well-being of their communities. Without this freedom, corporations profit from convenience while children suffer the unseen consequences. A call to action. If you recoil at the idea that wireless technology could be eroding empathy, remember that we once scoffed at the notion that cigarettes caused cancer. Over time, evidence accumulates until ignoring it becomes irresponsible and immoral. Today, the data connecting EMFs to subtle neurological harm is mounting. Each school shooting that occurs under these conditions should prompt us to think, is Section 704 enabling corporate interests at the expense of our children's minds? We can no longer afford to view school violence, rising neurodevelopmental disorders, and gender identity challenges as isolated phenomena. They may be symptoms of a deeper crisis. We have a moral obligation to connect the dots and act, investigate the science, demand the repeal or amendment of Section 704, advocate for independent research and stricter guidelines that consider non-thermal EMF effects. Conclusion: reclaiming the future. A t-shirt matching Eric Harris's isn't what makes a modern shooter snap. The similarity is eerie, but superficial. What truly matters is the biological and developmental environment that shapes a child's capacity for empathy, self-control, and moral discernment. As long as Section 704 remains on the books, we cannot protect our children from involuntary exposure to potentially mind-altering radiation. When you next hear of a school shooting, think of Section 704. Think of the towers parents couldn't stop, the corporate profits prioritized over children's health, and the silent, invisible forces that might be rewriting the human code. Changing this law and reassessing EMF exposure may not solve every problem, but it could restore the fidelity of trait inheritance that once kept our communities stable and compassionate. Without that step, the chaos may only worsen. It's time to shine a light on this invisible threat and take back the right to protect our children's brains. Visit RF Safe to learn more.